Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the series where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by changes to tuning. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, but not necessarily with speed, so if you're chasing the last few tenths of a second at Sardinia to make grinding more efficient, I'm afraid this series probably won't help you. Now let's begin. Today I'll be covering suspension tuning. Well, some of it anyway. Suspension tuning is by far the most complicated part of setting up your car, not only because there's several parameters you can adjust, but also because it's somewhat dependent on your choice of tyres as well as the car itself, where differential, downforce, ballast, and gearing will generally remain similar no matter your choice of tyre. For this video I will cover body height or ride height, anti-roll bars, and natural frequency, since they tend to be the three parameters that have the biggest impact on the way your car handles. It's worth mentioning that the point of this video is not to tell you how to make your car faster. My aim with this series is to tell you what subjective differences you will feel when setting up your car, and my priority is to help you make your car easier to drive, as opposed to faster. I'll start with natural frequency, which in my experience is the most important single part of your suspension tune. Natural frequency, or spring rate, is a measure of how fast the coil springs will oscillate after applying a load. To common folk like us, it's basically a measure of how stiff the car is. Using the Toyota Hiace as a visual example, I'll show how natural frequency affects the way your car drives. The main effect you'll see is body movement. A low natural frequency will result in a car that leans a lot, and can deal with bumps or high curbs well. A high natural frequency will make the car lean less, and it'll be more unsettled by bumps and curbs. The way you set your natural frequency will depend on the tyres you choose. Running the car on high grip racing tyres with a low natural frequency will result in excessive body roll bordering on uncontrollable depending on the car. This is because the grip of the tyres is quite literally throwing the car around. Imagine tying yourself by the waist to a streetlight, and then running away from it as fast as you can. As the rope tenses around your waist, the rest of you soaks up the inertia and your body flails around like a rag doll. I don't recommend trying this. If we fit low grip comfort tyres to the same car, you'll see that the body roll is now much more controllable. This is like tying yourself to a streetlight and walking away from it instead of running. Next, here's the car on racing tyres with a high natural frequency. Notice how it's much more controlled because it's not leaning and throwing itself around. If we now try the stiff car with low grip tyres, it still corners flat, but it won't have as much grip, and as a result will be slightly slower. So why is this? An oversimplified way of explaining it is that a low natural frequency will actually give you more grip than a high natural frequency, because as the body leans, more weight is pushed onto the outside wheels. This is ideal on low grip tyres because they need all the help they can get. It's like having downforce, but it's caused by gravity instead of wind resistance. It can help the car pull itself around corners. Increasing the natural frequency and reducing that weight transfer will result in the outside wheels having less grip, and as a result the car will feel kind of like it's driving on ice. The reason that the extra body roll is controllable on weaker tyres is that they don't have enough grip to throw the car around as much, so the transition of body roll from one side to the other is slower, smoother, and more controllable. The reason this doesn't work on slick tyres is because as the outside wheels get more grip, the inside wheels lose it. This is fine on road tyres, since the difference between maximum and minimum grip is fairly small and manageable. On racing tyres, the difference in grip levels is much larger between the outside wheel that's got weight on it versus the inside wheel that doesn't. This can result in a car that feels like it's wandering, especially if you don't have downforce. So, if you make a small adjustment at high speed in a straight line, the car can feel like it's going to keep turning. The other downside is with more grip the car will change direction faster, meaning all of that body movement happens in a shorter space of time and is more violent as a result. This is part of the reason that fully upgrading a car without making any suspension tweaks can often result in a car that feels terrible. The default settings have a low natural frequency. Coupled with a lowered ride height, this can cause more issues, which I'll cover later on in this video. So, we've established that if you have more grip, you should be more stiff. Hang on, that didn't come out right. Anyway, what happens when we change the natural frequency between the front and the rear? To test this, I'm using a Honda S2000 that's fully upgraded on racing tyres but without a turbo. Generally, it's a very friendly car with a slight tendency towards oversteer. The current footage shows the car with a high natural frequency of 3.30 at the front and the rear. So how about if we reduce the frequency at the front? Setting the front to 2.50 and leaving the rear at 3.30 will make the front end softer, resulting in more grip at the front while the rear stays flat. This results in the car feeling more agile. However, when changing direction quickly, the car can become unsettled, since the tyre with the most grip is the outside front, which is pulling the car towards the inside or apex of the corner. It's controllable on this S2000, however, as you drive cars with increased power, you may run into problems with overall stability, especially on mid or rear-engined cars. If we reverse the changes so that the front frequency is at 3.30 and the rear is 2.50, the wheel with the most grip is now the outside rear wheel. This means the rear end is less likely to break traction, meaning your car is more stable. Notice how I'm accelerating sharply out of the corners and the car is reluctant to transition to oversteer. This means that the car is easier to drive but will feel slightly more prone to understeer. However, there are ways in which this can make your car harder to control. Here is an 1100 horsepower Corvette from my Taming a Monster series going through the Schwedenkreuz sector of the Nürburgring. It has the frequency set to 3.30 at the front and 3.15 at the rear, and it takes this section fairly well with no real drama. Here is the same car with the rear frequency dropped to 2.50. And while it has slightly better traction on corner exit, watch how the dip in the road makes the car wander to the left, making it more difficult to recover for the next turn. Worse still, the soft rear means that the back end can lift during braking, resulting in very unstable braking. As a small side note, I haven't really touched on how natural frequency will affect the car's ability to take bumps. This is because it doesn't have as much of an effect on the overall driving experience as the body roll does. As you've already seen, a car with racing tyres fitted will need the increased frequency to remain controllable. The result is that the car will be unsettled by high curves slightly more than if it has a soft natural frequency, but it's a bit of a necessary trade-off. You can slightly counteract this, however, by fitting smaller wheels. So, that was a detailed explanation of natural frequency, and here's the short version. If your car has racing tyres fitted, you'll need a natural frequency of roughly 3.0 or higher to keep the body movement under control. If you have sports tyres, I would recommend somewhere around 2.20 to 2.50, and if you have comfort tyres, I'd recommend roughly 2.0 or possibly lower. You can set the front frequency lower than the rear to make the car more agile at the cost of some stability, and you can set the rear lower than the front to make the car more stable at the cost of agility. Setting the values between the front and rear dramatically different to each other can result in some unfavourable handling characteristics. Next up, I'll cover body height, also known as ride height, since it somewhat works in tandem with natural frequency. It's much less complicated than the frequency simply being a measure of how high off the ground the car is. While its effects on the car's handling are nowhere near as obvious as with natural frequency, it can still have some very adverse side effects if it's not set up correctly. So obviously, the lower your body height, the lower your car is, and the majority of us like a lowered car. However, you can go too low, and here's some examples. The first is the Corvette C4, once again with the front end as low as it can go. I've used the Nürburgring Taurus layout to quickly get us to the Tiergarten section, which has a slight downhill that transitions into an uphill braking zone. In faster cars, this results in a pretty violent compression of the suspension. What happens next is that the steering violently wrenches to one side without any input from the driver, and the car is sent into the shadow realm. To many who have experienced this, it may seem like a glitch, but there is a reason for it. Wheel arch rubbing. The tyres have hit the inside of the wheel arches on full compression, resulting in the car being bump steered off the track. This is just one way in which arch rubbing can manifest itself. Cars that suffer from this include the C6 Corvette ZR1, the Lamborghini Gallardo, and the most well-known example is the E36 M3. However, there are worse examples of wheel arch rubbing. This is a Shelby GT350R, and the front end is lowered all the way. In this car, the wheels are already tucked inside the arches, and just turning the steering will result in arch rubbing. As a result, the car only gets about a quarter of its total steering angle. This means driving it is a very saddening experience. Other cars that suffer with this kind of affliction include the Datamaso Mangusta and the Volkswagen Beetle. The only way to prevent this is to increase ride height at the front, and increase natural frequency to prevent the front end from diving. As a result, your ride height should depend on the tyres you're using, much like the natural frequency. On racing tyres, you'll likely have a high natural frequency, allowing for a low ride height. On tyres with less grip, you'll probably have a lower natural frequency, meaning the car has more body movement, which makes arch rubbing more likely if the car has a low body height. You can use the same lowered height and increased frequency on low grip tyres, however the car will exhibit the driving on ice feeling I mentioned earlier. Now I'll give a brief overview of how ride height affects the handling using the S2000 once again, on racing soft tyres with the high natural frequency that I already recommended. A low ride height will allow the car to change direction more quickly due to a lower centre of gravity, but it will also make the car more prone to power oversteer. Running the ride height at the same level as stock makes the car feel slightly more planted, but it feels slightly less agile with changing direction. Running an abnormally high ride height will make the car feel very stable when accelerating out of corners, but it's even slower to change direction. Increasing ride height will also increase aerodynamic drag, reducing your top speed slightly. I did also experiment with setting the ride height higher at the front than the rear, and the other way around, though this didn't make a huge difference until I tried extreme differences. But generally, a nose down setup will cause more power oversteer, and a nose up setup will make the car more planted. The ride height will also affect the way the car handles curbs. A fully lowered car doesn't have enough suspension travel to deal with the bumps. A raised car with a high natural frequency will also be quite bouncy. With the height set 10 to 20mm above the minimum, it's somewhat less dramatic. So to conclude on ride height, the difference it makes is more subtle than with natural frequency, but, like with the frequency, it should be set based on the tyres you're using. A low ride height will help the car change direction more quickly, while increasing it will generally make the car less agile but easier to drive. If the ride height is too low, the car can suffer from wheel arch rubbing, and if it's too high, the car can become unstable or potentially even roll over. The last thing I will cover today is the anti-roll bar adjustment. Anti-roll bars are fairly simple. The stronger they are, the more they prevent body roll. However, unlike with natural frequency, they only affect lateral movement. So, they can prevent the car leaning from side to side in the corners, but they won't stop the car from lunging under heavy braking. To show how anti-roll bars can affect the handling, I will take the S2000 once again to the Nürburgring, specifically the first sector. With a high natural frequency and a low but not minimum ride height, and racing tyres, we'll start with the anti-roll bar set to 10, the maximum. The car handles much as you'd expect. It has a very firm ride, but it's stable enough. If we now set the anti-roll bars to the other extreme, 1, the car is terrifying. If you hit a curb, the car will pogo, which can easily cause a crash. I then experimented with several cars on different tyres with different drivetrains to find a general consensus for how anti-roll bar settings will affect the handling. In general, a high front anti-roll bar setting will encourage oversteer when braking. This becomes more obvious if the rear anti-roll bar setting is lower. Not ideal on a Porsche. However, the same settings will also make the car slightly less prone to power oversteer. A high anti-rear roll bar coupled with a lower front anti-roll bar will make the car slightly more stable under braking. However, it'll be slightly quicker to transition to oversteer when accelerating, and potentially harder to rescue once it does start to slide. A low overall setting will make the car feel less composed and more prone to oversteer, even on nearly stock road cars. A high overall setting will make the car feel more predictable, though this can potentially lead to some understeer. For the majority of applications, I would recommend setting the front anti-roll bar between 5 and 10, with the rear anti-roll bar set to the same value or potentially 1 or 2 clicks higher if your car suffers with oversteer under braking. In front-wheel drives, I recommend a fairly low front anti-roll bar setting between 2 and 4. I would set the rear higher, though I couldn't find much subjective difference between setting it at 4 or 10. And I think that just about covers it. Hopefully my advice in this video has helped. This was episode 7 of Tuning for Beginners. Join me next time where I'll cover dampers, negative camber, and toe angle. Thank you very much for watching, and if this helps you, I'd be very grateful for your subscription. Take care, and ta-ra.